She was a 66-year-old widow, wealthy, educated, and believed she'd found love again with a young Harvard law student. But just 24 hours after their wedding, she was found dead in her bathtub. Was it a tragic accident, or the final move in a carefully calculated plan? What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about love, trust, and betrayal. Palm Beach, Florida. A breeze swept in from the Atlantic, rustling the tall palms that lined the estate of Judith Campbell, a 66-year-old widow whose life, from the outside, looked like something out of a magazine spread. Sprawling mansion, pristine gardens, a grand piano in the parlor, and a net worth of over $12 million. But if you look closer, the house was too quiet, too still. Judith spent most of her days alone in that mansion. Her husband, Charles Campbell, a legendary hedge fund manager, had passed away 6 years prior, leaving her everything. And while the world assumed she was living a dream, Judith would have traded all of it for companionship. The kind that didn't feel like pity. The kind that didn't treat her like a fragile relic of a past generation. Her only daughter, Rachel, a 36-year-old trauma surgeon in Chicago, visited rarely. Their relationship had grown distant after Charles's death. Judith's once full dinner table now sat empty every night, save for a single wine glass and a carefully folded cloth napkin, habits she couldn't shake. But Judith wasn't the type to wallow. She had been a tenured professor of art history at Yale in her younger years, and even in widowhood, she carried herself with grace, intellect, and an undeniable spark. In recent years, she had thrown herself into philanthropy, speaking at women's conferences, hosting charity luncheons, mentoring younger women through grief. She became something of a local figure, the elegant, fiercely independent widow who hadn't given up. And then she met Elias Monroe. It was at a Harvard Law School seminar where Judith had been invited to speak about estate planning and legacy giving, a topic that had, ironically, once bored her to tears. But that afternoon, someone in the front row caught her attention. A young man, maybe mid-20s, tall, clean-cut, with sharp eyes and a calm confidence that stood out in a room full of anxious law students. After her talk, he approached her. "Excuse me, Mrs. Campbell, your story really moved me. My mother passed away last year, and I've been struggling to figure out how to carry her memory forward. May I ask, how did you do it?" Judith would later recall how sincere he had sounded. Not rehearsed, not smooth, just real. His name was Elias. He was 26. He'd grown up in Dorchester, a rough neighborhood in Boston, raised by a single mother who worked nights as a custodian at Mass General. No father, no money, but he had earned his place at Harvard the hard way. Scholarships, jobs, sleeping in his car some semesters just to keep going. That day, they talked for almost an hour. She thought nothing of it at first. A bright student, a thoughtful question, a touching backstory. But the next morning, there was an email in her inbox. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me yesterday. I haven't felt that seen in a long time. Elias." And from there, it began. They started exchanging emails, then phone calls, then dinners. At first, it felt maternal. Judith saw herself as a mentor, perhaps even a surrogate aunt of sorts. But there was something different about Elias. He listened. He remembered things. He wasn't intimidated by her wealth, nor did he seem to care. And when he looked at her, she felt alive. Not old, not past her prime, but seen. Of course, when Rachel found out her mother was spending time with a man 40 years younger, her reaction was swift and cutting. "Mom, you know how this looks. He's using you. It's obvious." But Judith didn't see it that way. "Rachel, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But I've lived long enough to know when I'm being manipulated. Elias is different. He doesn't want anything from me. If only that had been true." At first, Judith kept her growing friendship with Elias quiet. Palm Beach society could be ruthless, and she had no interest in giving the ladies at her book club fresh gossip to pass around their espresso cups. But the more time she spent with Elias, the more difficult it became to hide. He visited her in Florida over winter break. She had invited him for a holiday thank you dinner after he helped her draft a new charitable trust for her foundation. One dinner turned into 3 nights. By the time the New Year's Eve fireworks exploded over the Atlantic, Judith was holding his hand on the balcony, her heart racing like it hadn't in years. There was no denying it anymore. She was falling in love. And Elias? He didn't blink. He complimented her laugh. Said she was elegant, rare, a mind sharper than anyone he knew. When Judith voiced hesitation about the age gap, the public judgment, the whispered insults she knew would come, Elias silenced her with the kind of gaze she thought only existed in old films. "I don't care what people say," he whispered. "You're not a number to me, Judith. You're the only real person I've ever met." She wanted to believe him. She chose to believe him. Back in Boston, Elias's classmates began to notice changes. He no longer stressed about money. His winter coat was new. He had a MacBook instead of a duct-tape Lenovo. One roommate joked, "Guess law school's paying dividends early, huh?" Elias brushed it off. "I'll land it aside gig helping a wealthy donor with some estate planning." He'd say. It wasn't exactly a lie. He never told them her name. He never posted photos. But quietly, he'd fly down to Palm Beach every other weekend. And every time he came back, there was something different about him. More confident. More polished. Some would later say, more calculating. In March, they took a trip to Italy. Rome, Florence, Lake Como. Judith had never seen him so carefree. They stayed in luxury suites, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, strolled along cobbled streets like a couple out of a glossy travel ad. To outsiders, it looked like a woman showing her son the world. But behind closed doors, they shared a bed. Judith worried. She asked, more than once, "Are you sure this is what you want? Me? Not someone your age." And each time, Elias looked her in the eyes and said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That was when he first mentioned marriage. Not in a grand gesture, just a quiet moment over morning coffee. "If I asked you to marry me, would you laugh at me?" She didn't laugh. She cried. But not everyone was convinced. Rachel, Judith's daughter, grew more suspicious with every passing month. She hired a private investigator, a retired cop named Dan Feeney, to look into Elias's background. Dan came back with almost nothing. No criminal record. No lawsuits. Just a history of hardship, excellent grades, and a resume that read like the American dream. But something about him didn't sit right. "He's clean," Dan told Rachel. "But too clean. Too perfect. Nobody comes up from where he came from without something getting messy. It's like he's erased the first 20 years of his life." Rachel begged her mother to slow down, to think, to consider a prenup at the very least. Judith's response, "I know you think I'm being foolish, but I've buried a husband, survived cancer, raised you mostly on my own. I'm not naive. If this ends in heartbreak, so be it. But I'd rather live these years fully than tiptoe around fear." That conversation didn't end there. The next day, Rachel called again, not as a daughter, but as a doctor. "Mom, I need to ask you something clinical, not emotional," she began. "If you saw a 66-year-old patient with new behavioral shifts, impulsive financial decisions, and romantic fixation on someone 40 years younger, would you consider cognitive decline a possibility?" Judith didn't respond at first. Then she said calmly but firmly, "Rachel, I'm not your patient. I'm your mother, and I still know who I am." Rachel sighed. "I'm sorry, but I've seen it. Mom, people get lonely, and it makes them vulnerable. I know you think this is about love, but what if it's not? What if it's just the dopamine rush of attention?" There was silence on the line. Then Judith whispered, I didn't raise you to speak to me like I'm an idiot in a hospital bed. Rachel flinched. I didn't mean it that way. I'm scared for you. I know, Judith said, but you're also angry. Because I didn't follow your advice. Because I dared to want something you didn't approve of. Rachel paused. Then, no, I'm angry because you're letting a stranger walk in your life and rewrite everything Dad helped build. That landed like a slap. Judith's voice grew colder. Your father is gone, and I'm the one left picking up the pieces. Don't weaponize his memory to control mine. They didn't speak for 2 weeks after that. Rachel sent a text on her mother's birthday. Hope you're well. No reply. 3 days later, she received a voicemail at midnight. Judith's voice was quiet, almost trembling. I miss you. I hate that we're like this, but I need to follow what makes me feel alive. Please don't let this be the thing that breaks us. Rachel listened to it twice, saved it, but didn't respond, because deep down, she feared something she couldn't admit. That maybe her mother didn't need saving. Maybe she just needed to feel something before it was too late. By early June, they were engaged. And just 1 month later, beneath a white floral arch in the backyard of her Palm Beach estate, Judith Campbell became Mrs. Elias Monroe. It was a small ceremony, less than 30 guests. No press. Rachel refused to attend. Judith wore an off-white gown, simple and elegant. Her gray hair swept into a low bun. Elias stood beside her in a tailored navy suit, holding her hands as he recited vows that would later make headlines. I don't see your age. I see your soul, and I promise to love, protect, and honor that soul every single day until my last breath. 24 hours later, Judith Campbell would be dead. That night, the house glowed with candlelight. Judith had arranged for the catering staff to leave early. She wanted the evening to belong to just the two of them. Elias carried her over the threshold of the master suite with exaggerated flair, and she laughed, brushing a tear from the corner of her eye. I feel ridiculous, she said, kicking off her heels. You look radiant, Elias replied, his voice almost reverent. They changed into silk robes and sat on the balcony, overlooking the Atlantic. The air smelled of gardenia and sea salt. Judith opened a bottle of vintage champagne, a wedding gift from a family friend, and poured 2 glasses. For your mother, Elias said softly, raising his flute. Judith smiled. And for your future. They clinked glasses. But as she sipped, Judith felt a slight unease. Not pain, not nausea, just a fluttering tightness in her chest. A weight she couldn't name. She chalked it up to nerves, to champagne, to being 66 and newly married to a man who hadn't been born yet when she defended her doctoral thesis. Elias seemed more subdued than usual. He watched her closely, too closely. When she leaned in to kiss him, he pulled back for a second before returning it. Later, they danced in the living room, barefoot, the record player crackling out an old Frank Sinatra tune. Judith hummed along, her head resting on Elias's chest. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything, he said. If I die tomorrow, just know I was happy tonight. Elias looked down at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Sadness? Guilt? Or something else entirely? He kissed her forehead. Don't talk like that, he murmured. At 11:52 p.m., Judith wrote a short note in her journal, a habit she kept since Charles's death. June 8th. I am now a wife again. There is something strange about the silence in this house tonight. Elias seems far away. I don't know if it's nerves or something darker. I want to trust what I feel, but sometimes feelings lie. Still, I am not afraid. I have made my choice, and I will live with it, whatever comes. She left the journal half open on the nightstand. At 12:43 a.m., the security system blinked and went dark. At 1:10 a.m., Elias walked into the master bathroom. He stood for several minutes, just watching the tub fill. Then he turned off the faucet and walked away. At 2:07 a.m., Judith got up from bed. A motion sensor by the hallway recorded her movement. She never came back. The morning after the wedding, the Palm Beach sky was cloudless, and the ocean shimmered beyond the terrace like nothing bad could ever happen there. Judith never made it out of the master bathroom. It was around 7:12 a.m. when Elias dialed 911. His voice, captured on the call recording later played in court, was breathless and shaky. "My wife, she's in the tub. I think she slipped. She's not breathing. Please hurry." When paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, they found Judith face down in the marble-soaking tub, her silver hair fanned out in the water like strands of silk. The tub was still warm. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Elias stood in a white robe, wet footprints trailing behind him. He told police they had celebrated quietly the night before, shared champagne, and stayed up late talking about future travel plans. He said he had woken up alone in bed, heard the water running, and when she didn't respond to his voice, he entered the bathroom and found her like that. He sobbed while talking, asked if he could ride in the ambulance, held her hand as they wheeled her out, covered in a pale blue sheet. It all seemed like a tragic accident, until it didn't. Detective Melanie Brooks, a veteran with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, was the first to quietly question the scene. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no struggle in the room. But Judith's wrist had light bruising, as if someone had grabbed her mid-fall, or worse, held her down. Even stranger, one of the security cameras by the back entrance had stopped recording at exactly 2:13 a.m., just a few hours before Judith was found dead. Elias told detectives he had no idea how to operate the system. But when officers checked the control panel in the security closet, it had clearly been manually disabled. Then came the will. 3 days before the wedding, Judith had amended her estate plan. A handwritten addendum, notarized by her private attorney, granted Elias full ownership of the Palm Beach estate, liquid access to $3 million in personal accounts, control over her charitable foundation. Judith's longtime financial advisor, who had managed her wealth for over 2 decades, was blindsided. She was careful, strategic. She never rushed decisions like that. He tried to reach her days before the wedding to review the changes, but she never called back. Rachel flew in from Chicago that same day. When she arrived at the estate and saw Elias sipping tea on the veranda like nothing had happened, something inside her broke. "You killed her," she whispered. "You don't even have the decency to pretend you're grieving." Elias didn't respond. He simply stood up, looked her in the eye, and said, "I loved your mother. I would never hurt her." But Rachel had made up her mind. She went straight to Detective Brooks and said 6 words that changed everything. "Please look into this man." The more police dug, the stranger Elias became. At Harvard, professors described him as bright but emotionally distant. One ex-girlfriend from undergrad declined to go on record, but called him controlling and manipulative. He had legally changed his last name at age 21, from Elias Decker to Elias Monroe. When asked why, he said it was to start fresh. But fresh from what? Elias Decker hadn't always dreamed of Harvard. At 17, his world revolved around survival. Not scholarships or legacy, but how to stay invisible long enough to avoid the next beating. He was shuffled through 6 foster homes in 8 years. The last one, a 2-bedroom duplex in Roxbury, was where things came to a breaking point. His foster father, Ray Dobbins, was a heavy drinker with a badge, a retired corrections officer who believed discipline meant control and control meant fists. Elias learned, young, that vulnerability was dangerous. He stopped crying by 10, stopped asking questions by 12. By 15, he had mastered the art of silence, listening more than speaking, reading people's needs before they voiced them. It made him a survivor, and eventually a manipulator. At school, He was quiet but brilliant. His English teacher once told him, "You write like someone twice your age." But at home, words didn't matter. What mattered was whether dinner came out hot, whether the TV volume was too loud, whether Ray had a bad day. It was during one of those bad days that everything changed. Elias had hidden a prepaid debit card in his sock drawer, money he'd saved from tutoring other students. Ray found it and accused him of stealing. The next thing Elias remembered was the flash of a belt, the crash of a lamp, and the sharp metallic taste of blood in his mouth. That night, Elias ran. He didn't have a plan, but he had an instinct. Hide your tracks, reinvent yourself, and never owe anyone anything again. Over the next few months, he couch-surfed through Boston, eventually finding shelter in a library that stayed open late. He read books on law, psychology, finance. He discovered the power of image, how people believed what you projected if you were clean-shaven, well-spoken, and just damaged enough to be sympathetic. He started calling himself Elias Monroe, a name borrowed from a Revolutionary War pamphlet he'd read once. It sounded respectable, safe, forgotten even. The fraud charges that would haunt his sealed juvenile record came from this period. A desperate attempt to create a fake student ID, open a credit card, and buy a suit so he could sneak into a scholarship interview. The assault charge? That was from defending himself when a man tried to exploit him in exchange for a place to sleep. He wasn't proud of any of it, but he never apologized either, because in his mind, every choice was simple: be used or use. And when he received the acceptance letter from Harvard Law, full ride, no conditions, Elias finally believed he had won. But old instincts don't die easily. Even at Harvard, with polished shoes and perfect grades, Elias carried the voice of Ray Dobbins in his head. Nobody gives a damn about you. You're either prey or predator. When Judith Campbell stepped into that lecture hall, elegant and composed, Elias didn't see a target. Not at first. He saw someone like himself, a person who had lost too much, who smiled because it was safer than showing pain. He hadn't meant to fall into her life, but once he did, he couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like to finally be cared for, not pitted, not tolerated, but truly loved. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous thing of all. A deeper background check revealed a sealed juvenile record in Boston. With court permission, detectives gained partial access. At age 17, Elias had been charged with fraud and assault, stemming from a scheme involving stolen credit cards and a violent altercation with a foster parent. He had escaped prison time thanks to a lenient judge and his high school principal's plea for mercy. Judith never knew any of this. To her, Elias was the self-made success story, the survivor, the lover who looked past her age and made her feel whole again. But to Detective Brooks, he was a groom with a motive, a plan, and just enough charm to make it work. The official cause of death came back 2 days later. Judith Campbell had died by drowning, but the pathologist's report revealed something far more troubling. Judith had no head trauma, no visible abrasions from slipping, and the bruising on her wrists was consistent with manual restraint. More chillingly, water was found not only in her lungs, but in her stomach, a detail that suggested she had been conscious and struggling when submerged. She hadn't slipped. She had been held under. Detective Melanie Brooks reread the report in silence. It didn't confirm murder outright, but ruled out accident. Someone had forced Judith into that tub and held her there until she stopped breathing. And there was only one other person in the house that night. At the same time, financial records began painting a picture that was hard to ignore. Judith's attorney confirmed that just 3 days before her death, she had signed an emergency codicil to her will, named Elias Monroe as the sole inheritor of her personal estate, replaced her daughter Rachel as co-executor of the charitable foundation. The changes had been sudden, unusual, and emotional. When asked why Judith had made such dramatic changes without legal consultation or formal estate restructuring, her attorney sighed. She said she was finally choosing happiness, that Elias deserved to be protected if something happened to her. She said, and I quote, "Rachel will never forgive me for marrying him, but he loves me, and I want him to have everything I built." The lawyer tried to advise her to wait, to let the honeymoon pass, but she insisted, and just 72 hours later, she was gone. Rachel hired her own attorney. Then she filed a civil motion to contest the new will, citing suspicious circumstances and potential undue influence. "My mother was smart, yes," she told the court, "but she was also vulnerable. Elias came into her life during a moment of weakness, and everything about this feels like a setup." She provided emails showing that Judith had previously questioned Elias's intentions, asking her financial advisor for help drafting a prenuptial agreement, one that was never finalized. More damning, a series of text messages from Judith's best friend emerged. One message, dated 3 weeks before her death, read, "Elias wants to move up the wedding. Says he's worried about my health, but I'm starting to wonder if he's just worried about the money." When questioned again, Elias remained calm. "I didn't even know about the will," he said. "Judith never told me. I never asked." He insisted that they had been happy, that they spent the night of their wedding laughing, drinking champagne, and dancing barefoot in the living room. He denied touching the security system. He denied even knowing the code. But when investigators subpoenaed phone data, they discovered Elias had Googled how to disable Lorik's security DVR at 1:41 a.m., less than 30 minutes before the system went offline. And that was when the murder investigation officially began. News broke fast. Widow's death after wedding sparked suspicion. Palm Beach tragedy. Did a Harvard groom kill for millions? Talk shows speculated. Online forums dissected every photo of the wedding. Old classmates of Elias came forward anonymously, describing a man who had always played the long game. Some called him a con artist. Others called him a genius. But one former roommate from Harvard said something that stuck with Detective Brooks. He used to say, "People trust what they want to believe. That's all it takes." The trial of Elias Monroe began exactly 8 months after Judith Campbell's funeral. The courtroom was packed. Local news stations lined the courthouse steps. Palm Beach hadn't seen a scandal this sensational in decades. A young, Ivy League groom accused of murdering his wealthy bride less than a day after saying "I do." Inside the courtroom, Rachel Campbell sat stone-faced behind the prosecution table, clutching her mother's favorite scarf in her lap. Elias walked in wearing a gray tailored suit, his hair neatly trimmed, face expressionless. To the jury, he still looked every bit the clean-cut Harvard gentleman. But the prosecution was ready to tear that image apart. The case against him. The prosecutor, Margaret Lyons, laid out a devastating timeline. Elias had gained Judith's trust, isolated her from friends and family, and pushed for a rushed wedding. He had encouraged last-minute changes to her will, making himself sole beneficiary. Just hours before Judith's death, he searched online how to disable her security cameras, then disabled them. Judith's autopsy showed signs of restraint and no evidence of a fall. Then came the emotional blow. A forensic analyst testified that Elias's skin cells were found under Judith's fingernails, indicating a struggle. And perhaps most damning, Judith's attorney testified under oath. "I begged her to wait before making changes to the will. She said Elias made her feel young again. She believed him. I think she wanted to." Gasps echoed through the gallery when the prosecution read out Judith's last email to her estate planner, sent the morning before the wedding. "If I don't do this now, I'll lose him. But I keep waking up with this knot in my stomach. What if Rachel's right?" Elias's lawyers had a different story. They painted him as a devoted husband, the victim of a bitter daughter looking to reclaim control of a fortune she felt entitled to. They argued. The will change was Judith's decision, made from place of love. Elias had no history of violence or abuse. There was no video footage, no direct witness, and no smoking gun. They claimed the security system malfunctioned, and the Google search was a coincidence. As for the DNA under Judith's nails, they were newlyweds, the defense said. They were physically intimate. Of course his DNA was on her body. Elias never took the stand. But during closing arguments, his attorney looked straight at the jury and said, Judith Campbell wasn't murdered. She slipped. She drowned. And now my client is being crucified for falling in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Rachel took the stand. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't leave Elias for a second. But before Rachel took the stand, the courtroom had already been rattled by a series of expert testimonies. First came Dr. Evelyn Marks, a renowned forensic psychologist with over 20 years of experience profiling financial predators. She spoke with calm authority. Men like Elias Monroe are not violent in the traditional sense. They use affection, validation, and intimacy as tools. Their weapon is trust. She explained a phenomenon called empathic mirroring, where manipulators reflect back exactly what their target longs to hear. It's not love, she said. It's strategy, designed to make the victim feel chosen, seen, indispensable. The defense objected. Speculative. But Judge Herrera allowed her to continue, citing its relevance to motive and behavioral pattern. Next, the prosecution called an elder abuse investigator from the Florida office of the Attorney General, Vincent Cole. He testified that in over 200 financial exploitation cases involving elderly women, 91% involve romantic grooming. What makes this one rare, he said, is that it ended in a death, not just a drained bank account. Then came a surprise witness, Judith's private hairdresser, Nina Faulkner, someone no one expected to be relevant. But Nina revealed that, during Judith's final appointment before the wedding, she had quietly asked for a short style, just in case it looks better in the casket. Gasps rippled through the gallery. She smiled when she said it. Nina clarified. But there was something in her voice, like a woman who knew too much but didn't want to believe it. The defense fought back hard. They brought in a digital forensics consultant who argued that the timestamp for the Lorix DVR shutdown could have been manipulated or caused by a routine software update. He added, "There's no direct evidence that Mr. Monroe touched the system." Then they called Dr. Leonard Prentice, a geriatrician, who suggested that Judith's death could have been triggered by silent cardiac arrhythmia followed by drowning, especially after emotional stress and alcohol. She had a history of hypertension, he noted. Combine that with a hot bath, emotional excitement, and sedatives prescribed for sleep, and yes, it's possible she fainted. The prosecution countered with a toxicologist who confirmed no sedatives were present in her system. Only alcohol, and not enough to cause loss of consciousness. Finally, Elias's lead attorney, James Walcott, gave a stirring performance during cross-examination of Detective Melanie Brooks. "You believe Mr. Monroe planned this for over a year," he said. "Yes," she answered. "Then why didn't he flee?" "Because he didn't think he needed to." Or maybe, Walcott said, turning to the jury, "It's because he didn't commit a crime. My mother wasn't perfect. She made bold choices, but she was not stupid. She was lonely, and he knew exactly how to get to her. Flattery, pity, and just enough affection to blind her to his true intentions." She paused, then added, "He didn't kill her with a gun. He used trust, and that's the cruelest murder of all." After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. Elias Monroe was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison without parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Rachel wept quietly and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. A month after the verdict, Rachel Campbell returned to the Palm Beach estate one last time. The house had been frozen in time. Her mother's perfume still faint on the silk pillows, a stack of wedding cards unopened on the hallway table. Rachel wasn't here to reminisce. She had come to clean out the study. That's when she found it. Tucked inside the bottom drawer of Judith's antique writing desk, beneath a leather-bound planner and a folded scarf, was a sealed envelope. It was addressed simply, "To be opened if something happens to me." Her hands trembled as she slid her finger under the flap. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, graceful cursive, every letter perfectly formed. It was Judith's voice, frozen in ink. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, something's gone terribly wrong. I know you don't approve of Elias. I know you think he's after my money, and maybe part of me wondered too. But I also know what it feels like to lie awake at night, aching for someone to see you, not as a name on a bank account, not as a fading photograph on a mantle, but as a woman, still here, still hoping. I've lived a long life, Rachel, and I've buried more than I care to name. Your father, my friends, even pieces of myself. But Elias made me feel alive again. If he fooled me, I'll take that shame with grace. But if he truly loved me, and the world refused to believe it, I want you to remember, love doesn't always look the way we expect. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I'm sorry I couldn't convince you. But please, don't let bitterness steal what joy I had left. I loved you with everything I had. I hope someday you'll understand. Mom. Asterisk. Rachel sat in that silent room for over an hour, the letter open in her lap, tears sliding down her cheeks. Was it a love story? Was it con? Or was it both? The truth, as always, had been buried with the dead, and locked away behind the quiet smile of a man now serving 35 years behind bars. In the months that followed, Rachel established a foundation in her mother's name. Judith's voice, dedicated to protecting elderly individuals from emotional exploitation, financial abuse, and coercive relationships. It became a powerful movement, not only in Florida, but nationwide. Elias Monroe remained silent behind prison walls. He declined every interview. No appeals were filed. But once, in a letter to his former roommate, he reportedly wrote, "All I ever did was give her what she wanted. I just didn't realize how badly I needed it too." Judith Campbell was laid to rest in a modest private ceremony, her ashes buried beneath a stone bench overlooking the ocean. There was no grand mausoleum, no golden plaque, just her name and one line carved beneath it. "I lived. I loved. I paid the price." For a few months after the verdict, the name Judith Campbell still echoed on talk shows and news panels. Was she a victim? Was she naive? Or had she been a woman reclaiming her power, only to be punished for it? Everyone had an opinion. But as time passed, the world moved on. New scandals took the spotlight. New tragedies swallowed the news cycle. But for Rachel, the story didn't fade. It haunted her in quiet, unexpected moments. The smell of her mother's favorite perfume lingering in a department store, the sight of white roses at a wedding, or the sound of a certain Frank Sinatra song playing in a grocery aisle. She kept the letter, framed it, read it every year on Judith's birthday. Palm Beach society had always whispered, but now, those whispers were crueler than ever. Some said Judith was a foolish old woman who got what was coming. Others called Elias a monster. A few still believed it had all been an accident. At the country club, one woman remarked, "Honestly, if she hadn't flaunted that relationship, maybe none of this would have happened." But others quietly disagreed. One former friend of Judith's, now in her 70s, said softly over lunch. She was brave. She loved out loud. That takes more guts than most of us ever had. At Union Correctional Institution, Elias Monroe kept to himself. He declined media interviews, didn't speak to other inmates much. He spent his days reading legal journals, working in a library, and writing, though no one knew what or for whom. Once, a guard claimed to have seen him staring at a photo, a printed image of Judith on their wedding day. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just sat there, still as stone. Some said he was cold. Others said he was mourning. But no one really knew who Elias Monroe truly was. Even with the conviction, something about the case never fully settled. Why didn't Elias try to run? Why didn't he appeal? Why didn't he ever break down and confess or deny with passion? Detective Melanie Brooks, now retired, once said in an interview, "I've worked homicide for over 20 years. I've seen monsters. Elias didn't feel like one. But maybe that's the danger. The worst ones are the ones who make you feel safe." In a rare moment of public vulnerability, Rachel gave a TED-style talk 3 years later. Her topic? The cost of not listening to the people we love. She didn't mention Elias by name, didn't rehash the trial, but she did say this: "If I could go back, I wouldn't stop trying to protect my mother. But maybe I'd also try harder to understand her. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was hopeful. And there's a big difference." The audience gave a standing ovation. And for the first time in years, Rachel smiled without crying. 5 years passed. The Palm Beach mansion was eventually sold to a tech millionaire from New York. The rose garden Judith once tended was paved over for a tennis court. The marble bathtub was ripped out and replaced with a minimalist walk-in shower. Judith Campbell, the elegant widow, the controversial bride, had faded from the front page, but not from memory. Her foundation, Judith's voice, continued to grow under Rachel's leadership. It had funded over 100 legal interventions in elder financial abuse cases and helped change legislation in 2 states. At every gala, every speaking event, Rachel kept her mother's photo close. But she never spoke of Elias. On a rainy afternoon in March, an envelope arrived at Rachel's office. No return address, just a prison mailroom stamp from Union Correctional and handwriting she hadn't seen in years. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. "Rachel, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. Your mother saved me. Before her, everything I did was survival. Pretending, calculating. But with her, I didn't have to pretend. Not at first. Then the wedding came. The will. The pressure. The voice in my head I thought I'd buried came roaring back. The one that says love isn't real, only leverage. And I let it win. I told myself I didn't do it, that it was an accident. But deep down I know what I did. I let her die. I didn't hold her under, but I didn't pull her up either. I wanted the money, and I hated myself for it. If that makes me a killer, so be it. I'm sorry. Elias. Asterisk. Rachel sat for a long time after reading it. Not because she forgave him, not because it brought closure, but because it confirmed the truth she feared most. Her mother had loved a man who knew how to be tender, and chose, in the end, not to be. A journalist writing a book about the case once asked Rachel in a live interview, "Do you think Elias truly loved your mother?" Rachel didn't answer right away. Then she looked up and said, "I think he wanted to, and I think she believed that was enough." The interviewer didn't press further, but the silence that followed lingered in the room, thick, fragile, and full of questions no verdict could answer. After the show aired, Rachel received dozens of letters. Some were from elderly women thanking her for speaking out. Others were from daughters who had lost their mothers under quieter circumstances. One note read, "My mother didn't marry a con man, but she died feeling unloved. Your story reminded me to be more present with those who stay silent." Rachel replied to everyone, She also received one unexpected message from a woman named Cynthia Alston, a retired school principal from Massachusetts. Cynthia had been Elias's high school mentor. "I don't know if he became a monster," she wrote, "but when I knew him, he was a boy with bruises he didn't know how to name, and a hunger for affection so deep it made him dangerous to himself." The letter didn't excuse anything, but it cracked something open in Rachel, a door she'd sealed long ago. That night, Rachel walked through the Palm Beach estate one final time before handing over the keys to the new owner. She wandered the halls barefoot, her fingers tracing the grooves in the banister, the chipped corner of the study desk, the edge of the fireplace where her mother used to hang seasonal wreaths. She paused in the parlor where Judith's grand piano still stood. For a moment, she sat down and lifted the cover, pressing one single key, a minor. The sound echoed in the empty room, soft, uncertain, unresolved. In that stillness, Rachel allowed herself to ask a question she'd long buried. What if love wasn't meant to last forever? What if its value came from the hope it created, not the ending it earned? She thought of her mother not as a victim, but as a woman who dared to leap, who bet on a feeling, who knew the risks and still chose the fall. On the anniversary of Judith's death, Rachel returned to the small stone bench by the ocean, the one her mother had asked to be placed there in her memory. She brought white roses and sat for a long time, listening to the waves. And for the first time in 5 years, she spoke aloud. "I miss you, and I hope, wherever you are, you still feel loved." The ocean didn't answer, but the wind carried her words out over the water. And somewhere, in the space between silence and memory, Judith Campbell lived again. If this story moved you, or made you question the people we choose to trust, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories told with heart, honesty, and a touch of heartbreak. Thanks so much for watching.